Fall 2013. Two friends bet on how long they could stay awake. Everything would have been fine if one night something unexplainable didn't happen to one of the friends. But as usual, to make you understand this story, and why this video is called this way, I will start from the beginning. It all started 2 weeks ago, when our protagonist Michael and his co-worker William had a dialogue. William claimed that 3 days without sleep was all it took to kill a grown man. Michael refused because he didn't believe it. Look, I'm in college. I'm up practically every night for a week. There's no way someone can die from just 3 days of no sleep. I'm telling you, man, there's been a lot of studies, look it up. 3 days and you go crazy. Michael offered William a bet. Whoever was the first to break their sleepless streak would have to be on early shift duty for a month with their least favorite team member, G. When G spoke, he would state his thoughts in paragraphs consisting at their core of the words I, me, and myself. Combined with his morning coffee and his voice sounding like television static, a headache between 5:45 and 11 a.m. was assured for one of our heroes. The first few nights went very easy for Michael. The 3 days were very easy for him since Michael was a student. No doubt he was tired. His eyes seemed dry and very tired, but that was the way it was more during the day than at night. Michael and William would call each other at night, proving that they were not sleeping. Michael used this time to finish his term paper. He had a lot of time on his hands after it, and Michael was leafing through social media and playing games. Time whizzed by him. When Michael drove to work, he had to wear sunglasses because his eyes were very sensitive to bright light. When he blinked, it took him a few seconds to get rid of the blurriness and focus. However, it was all surmountable, and when day 3 passed, Michael cheerfully said hello to William. "See, I told you, no craziness. I don't know, I can't concentrate on anything really, and I feel uncomfortable all the time. Like I'm being watched all the time. Even my clothes feel like they're suffocating me." Michael shrugged. "Well, the 'we're being watched' quote is probably G being pissed at us for being 5 seconds late on the break. The bastard thinks he's the manager or something." William looked very tired and kept yawning throughout the day. Michael grinningly reminded him that he could quit at any time. He himself was feeling out of sorts as well, but the thought that he could win William over was making him ecstatic. In hindsight, I can say that it was probably the sleep deprivation that made me an already asshole even more manic. I giggled out loud more often than I'd like to admit, even when William wasn't talking to me. 5 days later, something terrible happens to William. During a late-night conversation with William, Michael's trance was broken by a violent crunching sound coming from William's side. It was a horrible, horror-inducing sound, like a watermelon being crushed under a truck. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. "Are you all right?" There was no answer. Michael was scared to death and began screaming William's name louder and louder until he screamed. He was shaking with terror, but managed to hang up the phone and call the police. When Michael pulled up, William was gone. The cops didn't bother to put his body in the ambulance and gently informed Michael that he was dead on arrival. "What the hell happened? A break-in?" whispered Michael. The police officer shook her head and lowered her eyes. She said what would soon become their official statement. "He passed away quietly in his sleep." They asked Michael a few questions. He didn't know his family or his friends. He was just a co-worker at a large company. Showing the police his location tracking app to make sure Michael was home at the time of the incident, he said that William had stopped answering his cell phone, and he was worried because he knew he lived alone. Michael was told they would contact him if he needed him after the autopsy and examination. They also gave him contact information for support services. "I don't even know how I managed to get home. For hours I sat silently on the side of my driveway. The mosquitoes flew in to feast, but I felt nothing. I remember wishing the curb would just slide off me, into the ditch, into the sewer, until I was washed away into nothingness. I sat there, numb, until the sun came up." After the incident, Michael couldn't sleep for 2 more days, even if he wanted to. He was given leave from work and school. He didn't tell his family what had happened. Calls and messages from friends were also ignored. I felt like William's death was my fault, and my emotions were divided between anger and fear. It must have been the lack of sleep, right? Wasn't it my fault? Why didn't I tell the police about the sound I heard that night? What was it? I could barely close my eyes as these thoughts battered around in my head, as if threatening to break free. As the irrational thoughts swirled around in my head, I fell into despair and curled up in a ball on the floor. The blinds were closed, and I couldn't tell the difference between day and night. My body and mind wanted me to rot, and I obeyed. Lying on the cool wooden floor, tears lubricated my sore eyes, and I let sleep master me. Michael awoke to a multitude of strange sensations: wet moss under his hands, the sounds of wildlife, and the smell of rotting bark filled his senses. The rain was so light that it was more like mist washing over his face. Michael's eyes grew accustomed to the brilliant night sky, and he found himself in an unfamiliar forest. Before he could think, thunder rolled across the ground. It was heavy enough that several branches fell from the trees. Then another, closer. Michael tried to rise to his feet, nearly falling back to the ground from another blow. Closer still. He gasped and ran to the side, hoping to get out of the way of whatever it was. I braced myself against the tree trunk, trying to determine the direction of the monstrous movements. Suddenly they stopped. I held my breath, as if that could keep me safe. Clinging to the tree, I tried desperately to see anything in the sky above me. Only then did it dawn on me that I could no longer see the stars. Before Michael could react, the trees around him slammed into his body. He screamed and felt himself being lifted into the air, fist gripped by the monstrous creature. His legs were caught between two tree trunks, and he felt them crunch together with the branches. The creature had snagged him not quite off center, so Michael's arms and torso dangled in the air as it pulled him upward. Desperate to free himself, Michael screamed in pain, yanking and pulling the rest of his body away from his mangled legs, and finally, he began to tilt and fall back to the ground. As he fell, he picked up speed and was hurtling towards the ground below him when Michael woke up in a cold sweat on his floor. What the hell was that? It felt so damn real. As he said it, he could still remember his legs jacking up and snapping off as he pulled away from the thing. Michael wiped the sweat from his forehead and stood up, or rather, he tried to stand up. To his horror, his legs wouldn't listen. They looked fine, but as he massaged them with his hands, he felt nothing. When his mind desperately ordered them to move, they didn't even twitch. He felt like he was trying to move the rocks with his mind. At that moment, fear gripped him. He began to think he had forgotten the magic command my brain usually utters to move my legs. I prayed it was sleep paralysis, but the hands on the clock kept moving, but my legs didn't. It took me a little while to get over my panic, but eventually, I dragged myself to the kitchen, my rumbling stomach still sending signals to my brain. For once, I was glad my campus housing was small, one story. I drank some water from the bottle I'd left under the kitchen table, and slowly stood up, leaning on the chairs. For once, I was glad the chairs were bolted down. I ate a few bananas from the fruit bowl. Once seated, Michael shifted his feet into a comfortable position for sight. Seeing them tuck and hook into each other and feet dragging across the floor was scary for him, having lived so many years expecting them to carry him forward forever. Michael had his cell phone in his pocket and pulled it out. How long have I been out? Michael was badly shocked to see that he had slept all day. He thought about going to the police for help, but was afraid because he hadn't been completely honest about what had happened to William. Michael decided to call his family. He told them that he was having a hard time here, and that he had a leg injury that made it hard for him to get around. They said they would take the day off and book a plane ticket when they could. Michael thanked them and hung up. I wish I had told them I loved them, and that they wouldn't miss me so much. Now I'm glad they won't be able to make it. Exhausted from dragging himself to the countertop, and with a shrunken stomach satisfied with the meal, Michael closed his eyes as waking sleepiness lulled him back to sleep. A sharp, all-consuming pain rushed through my body, along with the adrenaline and shock. After a few moments, I realized where I was. Same forest, same night sky, the same trees clutching my legs. I was still in their grip, my legs mostly attached to my body. Unlike last time, I broke free and pulled my body away early enough to make it to the ground in time. I could hear the trees cracking and breaking in his grip as he lifted them up, probably inspecting them. Now that I knew he could see in the dark, and because of my lack of mobility and exhaustion, I rolled into a small depression in the ground and covered myself as best I could with earth, moss, and dead leaves. As I lay in deathly silence and repose, a shrill shriek rang through the air, and the trees rattled. The tremors shook the ground, and so close that I jumped on the spot. I sobbed in fear, clamping my fist over my mouth, leaving deep dents in my finger. The step flattened the trees and foliage at my side, about 3 feet from my body. I squeezed my eyes shut. Please, please, please. It was the first time I'd ever prayed. I begged for safety, feeling my consciousness flutter as I felt the pool of my blood grow deeper. When I opened my eyes, I saw a figure in the darkness, sitting with his back against a tree across from my hiding place. My blood ran cold, and for a moment, I stopped feeling pain. It was William, not in life, but in death. His skull and body had been crushed and turned into a bloody mess of guts. And yet, he looked at me. He opened the indistinguishable mess that used to be his mouth and said,
"They found you.
The giant creature grabbed me in its arms, this time with a dead grip. In a slow, gentle motion, it ripped off an arm and threw it into its mouth, then the other. Finally, its pearly teeth gleamed in the moonlight for a moment. Before consuming me, I was screaming for help from William, from anyone when I woke up. Michael called the police using Siri. They brought him to the hospital, where the doctors didn't know what to do with him. There were no apparent problems. No blood clots, no nerve or spinal damage, no stroke. They decided to keep him under observation for a few days, monitoring his condition. He asked them not to inform his family of this. At night, as the nurses left my hospital bed, I had time to think alone. The last dream took me back in time to before my leg injury. Maybe this time there is a chance to save myself, but I knew there wasn't. I was losing too much blood in the dream world, and this would only prolong my life. Perhaps by a few minutes or seconds, I was dreading going to sleep. So afraid of the death of the creature from my dreams, to see William again. I begged the doctors not to use any sedatives or anesthesia. I pretended to sleep at night when the nurses came to check on me. Michael had maintained his facade through 2 sleepless nights, but he yawned frequently and uncontrollably, and it took him a couple of seconds to a minute to focus his eyes. Dark circles became noticeable, and the nurses became increasingly concerned about his health. Soon enough, however, the doctors lost interest in determining a diagnosis, as new patients began to flock to the room. By the 3rd day, there was only one nurse looking after Michael. In the evening after dinner, I got to talking to the nurse. I learned that she was a student at my college and had come here for a clinical trial as part of the nurse training program. I cried, telling her that I never thought I would miss school. So many things I took for granted. She looked at me sadly and asked, "What about sleep? Don't you miss that?" I shook my head. "I don't. I have nightmares." She reassured me. "Hey, it'll be different this time, I promise." My hair stood up as fear crept into my mind. "What do you mean?" "I gave you some melatonin. It will put you into a deep sleep and help you relax, don't worry." She smiled. My face went white, but I held back a shaky smile. "Hey, thanks. Before you go, could you grab my phone?" And here I am. I can feel sleep coming on. I'm using speech-to-text conversion, but I hope you all understand me. I just needed a place to tell my story. I don't know who else would believe it. My family, I'm sorry I haven't told you all. I love you, Mom and Dad. I'm so sorry I dragged you into my stupid bet. I should have listened.